Hi, I'm Rick McGillis from BitAPI Hub, and I'd like to present a little bit about my company today. Oh, and hang in there for outtakes at the end. I'm going to introduce myself and my company. Next, I'll give you a non-technical overview of the company. After that will be a technical overview, which includes static calls, client-side API calls, dynamic calls, custom calls, and data calls. And at the end, I'll perform my closing and invitation. So enjoy the presentation and demos, and let's get started. Alright, so a little bit about me. I'm the CEO of BitAPI Hub. I have over 12 years of web development experience, and I invented the API engine we use at the company. So BitAPI Hub simplifies the API integration process by providing a unified API experience. And we do so with a short single file SDK. We also process your API workload for you to save bandwidth and processing power while speeding up your products. And the non-technical overview. APIs are application programming interfaces which allow you to chat with remote servers. It's just a special way to talk to a remote server, and that's pretty much it. When you call an API, your server slows down to wait for the response. The speed of your site depends on the load of the remote server, and that's not a good thing. That's where we come in. So the average visitor leaves your site in less than a second if it hasn't loaded. So BitAPI Hub uses the same cloud infrastructure as Pinterest and Amazon.com use. We also use Cloudflare's advanced DDoS protection to ensure that we're always up. And we also cache pre-configured API calls termed static calls, and the caching process speeds up the response time and retains your prospective clients. The technical overview. BitAPI Hub is much more than just a caching appliance. We dramatically lessen your SDLC software development lifetime cycle timeframe. Our short single file SDK replaces all of your API SDKs. Anything you're using with a separate API, you no longer have to use it. The machine that does less is more secure. There's a zero learning curve with our product. Remember one line of code and you can call any of your APIs. You may transact with servers in any format, which may include JSON, XML, SOAP, etc. And those three formats actually do not require you to write your own request in the target format. We'll convert that for you through the array that you post to our server. I'll show you that in a bit. So we use your language's array structures to interact with our SDK. Migration is a breeze. Use what you've already written. Your private API calls and credentials remain private. If your call never reaches the remote server, then your BitAPI Hub API call quota is not affected. If you run an API, you can integrate it with our service to add extra security while retaining your existing security mechanisms. Unlike our competitors who force you to use their own security measures, you don't have to go and rewrite that. If you have OAuth 2, OAuth 1, whatever you're using, you can use that. You can even write your own custom security measures into our system and we'll process it. And you may even integrate APIs that are not your own, but only as a privately available API. Only integrated APIs can use static and dynamic calls. So static calls are pre-configured API calls. You may not configure a static call at runtime. That's actually the whole point of a static call is it's static. Write your own static calls in your account area for easy access to repeated requests. All the static calls are cached for speed. There's only a 2-line configuration. You just tell us what API you want and what the name of the static call is, and we'll run it for you. Automatically takes care of any security restrictions in the remote server, and you'll use our credentials supplied by the API provider at the time of integration, so you don't have to register with every API you use. So let's see a demo. So let's start with our static call example. First, you include the SDK. Right now, I'm including the common file, and all that is just it's for examples only. What it does is it includes your consumer key and secret key. These are just demo keys that'll not be existent on the server, of course. So it's safe here. All right, so for our display process, we're just outputting the response in various formats. And that's what's in common. Okay, so first you create an instance of the SDK. So now we're going to configure our request. And at the end, you run the API call method. And for the purposes of this demo, we're sending the response into our display unit so it can look nice and pretty on the screen. Okay, so on static calls, what you need to configure is your API. You put the name of the API you're using. You get that from our docs environment. The name of the static call for that API. And our default format is actually JSON. So you don't actually need to send that. And if you speak a different language other than English, we might have it integrated. Just put your ISO language code in there and pass that along. We'll translate it as much as we can to your native tongue. And all that does is change your error messages, the messages that describe your error. You'll also have access to error codes, which are constants, to aid you in your programming endeavors. All right, so that's the static call structure. Let's see what one looks like. So the response structure for every valid response from our server has the HTTP code, the timestamp for when the request was made to the remote server, which could be different on your static calls since those could be cached and that could be valuable to you. Yeah, and your response data. In your response data, you have the remote server's HTTP status, which is 200 in this case. You have a list of the header data. Some headers, like set cookie, are removed for security purposes. And at the end, you also have your body data. And in this case, it's just a number. All right, so the static call is actually making a request to this server right here, blockchain.info's API. And that's the same response that we just got from blockchain.info.
Client-side API calls. So client-side API calls use your OAuth consumer key for Bit API Hub, not your secret key. And they can be shut off. You can shut off client-side API calls in your account area if you do not wish to use our service through client-side JS. You can only make static calls through the client-side JS for security reasons. You don't have to process the call on your server, thus reducing your processing power and bandwidth requirements. CORS enabled. So CORS enabled when you're transacting with a remote server through client-side JS, you're going to need access to CORS. You simply tell us what domain you want to transact with, and we will allow that domain to transact with our server. So let's see a demo.
Now let's take a look at our static calls on the client side. As you might notice, this one is an HTML file. And you simply post the API and the static call as per the last, as per our last example. And for the consumer key, which is essentially your username in this case, it's safe to post through JS. And now, when you're using JS, you have to ensure that you have access to the remote server due to cross-site scripting security issues. So now when you send protocol and domain name to us, we'll echo that back to you in your CORS header. And then you just process your request as normal. And that's the same response as on our last example.
Okay, we have dynamic calls. Configure your API calls on the fly. That's the whole point of a dynamic call. We'll validate your API against the API provider's RAML configuration so that you don't have to waste time processing bad requests. You may disable this functionality at any time. If for some reason our system is invalidating your request and you know for a fact that it's valid, just go ahead and bypass that feature. It's just there to make sure your responses are nice and speedy and we're not wasting an extra call. Can only be used to call APIs integrated with BitAPI Hub. So if your API is not integrated with BitAPI Hub, you can't use a dynamic call. We'll get to how you can call a non-integrated API in a second. They can be used to make calls to the remote API even if the call is not defined on our system. So if we haven't defined what call to validate for you, which we just discussed, you can still make the call. We just won't have the validation functionality for that call. So you don't need to rewrite the calls you've already written on our existing system. Just post it as is and you're good to go. So you may choose to store your credentials for the remote API encrypted in our database, so as not to send your credentials back and forth to our HTTPS server every time. You can send header data, query parameters, and or body data in your request, and you can use any method you'd like to, post, get, put, whatever. The only reason our demos are using get is so that I can show you the response on the remote server as opposed to the response that we send to you. It automatically takes care of any security restrictions on the remote server, just like the static calls do. And it's time for a demo for dynamic calls. Right, so our example for dynamic calls, we have the same response structure as before. Now this is actually an XML document right here. So we're talking to the BitAPI Hub server and requesting it in a JSON format. So that's why all of this XML data is now in JSON format. And if you want to see what the original file looks like, this is the same one we're calling in our dynamic call. Let's take a look at what the dynamic call configuration is. So first you, of course, start off with the API. Now in your configure parameters, you're going to want to set the URI that you want to call, which is everything from the base URI up to where the query parameters start. Now for your method, in this case we're using get. So we're posting the query parameters cc, unit, and dayf, which are of course these guys up here, cc, unit, and dayf. You can also post the body data, you can post header data, and you can change the method to whichever method you're using. For the purposes of our example, we're only using get, simply because I want to be able to show you the structure on the remote server for that call. Custom calls. You can call any API that's not integrated with BitAPI Hub, and you're still able to retain the benefits of using a short single file SDK. You may still transact with the remote server in the format of your choice. Use the familiar dynamic call format with the addition of only one extra token for the base URL of your target server. You don't need to use the account area to set up custom calls. And now for a demo for custom calls. Custom calls allow you to call any API that is not integrated with our system. And the only difference between a dynamic call and a custom call is that you specify the URL of the target API you're trying to reach. GitHub is not integrated with our system, so we use a custom call, and this is the output of that call we just made. And here it is on GitHub's website for your viewing pleasure. Data calls. Data calls are a proprietary technology to allow you to call multiple APIs at once with only a single configuration token, the name of the data call you wish to make. You may reconfigure your data calls at any time on the fly. Both public and private data calls can be reconfigured. Data calls may contain template data to dynamically compose ready-for-display CSS, JS, and HTML based on your response data. Compiled templates are returned in sections for CSS, JS, and HTML along with the responses from the remote servers, or you can opt to return only the compiled template if you wish. And you do that by setting the format value to HTML, which I'll show you in a second. And you can remove the Powered By logo. That's not mandatory on paid accounts. That's just there for free accounts or people who want to show their appreciation.
So let's see a demo of a data call. All right, now for our data call example. The only things you need to do for a data call is to set the name of the data call. You don't have to go and put a format in there, but that's actually in there for a reason, which I will show you in a second. Our testing data call actually makes a call to both the blockchain get difficulty static call, and it also incorporates the dynamic call afterward. And if you need to change a dynamic call, or a data call rather, you can set your call options parameter. Okay, so we're making a call to the testing API, or the testing data call. That's the response. When we're not requesting it in HTML, we're requesting in the default JSON format, so we can process it in any way we want to. Now, that parameter I was showing you, format, you set the format to whatever you want the response to be in. In this case, it's HTML. Now, when you set a data calls format to HTML, what you're telling the server is to return just the parsed template. Now, when you show this in HTML, you get a nice little joke. Your variables take in the data from the request information, and you can parse that request information, or that response information, directly into your template. In this case, we parse the get difficulties value into get difficulty right there. And if you remember, that's the output of get difficulty, and it wound up in our template. Now here's the output for the high temperature for today in Strongsville, Ohio. Our high temperature is 59 apparently, and we got that from day F, day 0, high temperature, which actually it's bumped up to 60 right now. Well, now we have 58. There we are, 58. Okay, everything's synced up now. Okay, so templates can have variables that correspond to whatever your request data has. We can parse that for you and send it back to you. Okay, and here's the Powered By logo I was talking about earlier. For now, we're using a light colored website, so our logo is formatted in the dark color. Now, if you wanted to have your link back color be light colored, let's go ahead and open this guy in a new tab. That's our dark colored logo. And that's the light colored logo. As you can see, you can't really see it on a white colored background, but if this was a black site or whatever, it would contrast nicely. Alright, in closing, there may be various reasons why you've watched this video. If you're an investor, if we gave you the link to this video, then we're seriously considering you as one of our investors, so congratulations. Developer, if you're a developer, right on. You're probably looking to supercharge your API integration process. You're invited to become part of our private beta. If you're a CTO, CEO, or other C-level executive, you are the reason why BitAPI Hub exists, and we want to help your business grow by speeding up the products you design and extending the number of features you're technologically capable of implementing. So if you're ready to join our beta or discuss your needs with us so that we can build a custom solution for you, send us an email at getstarted@bitapihub.com. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to doing business with you. You take care now. And now, enjoy some outtakes. So before we begin with the static call example, I'm going to show you a bit about the BitAPI Hub API. So before we begin with our static call example, I'm going to show you the SDK as it stands right now. So before we see the static call example, I'm going to show you a bit of the SDK. There it is. Right, so now we're going to take a look at custom calls. Custom calls allow you to call APIs that are not integrated with our system. The only difference between the dynamic call and the custom call is that you specify the URL of the remote server you're trying to call. So GetAPI Hub, or great, well now we have a composite name. So GitHub is not integrated with our system. Pickup shot test. And a non-technical interview, or overview rather. And the non-technical overview. CORS enabled. If you post a token with your domain in it, the token if CORS enabled. If you're trying to integrate with our API through the client-side JS, you're going to need access to CORS, which allows for cross-site transactions. And in order to do that, you put you post a token named CORS and add your CORS enabled. So when you're transacting with a remote server via client-side JS, you need to post the CORS token to tell us which bloody I'm gonna have so many cuts in this thing. CORS enabled. Take 3. You can send header data, body data, and query parameters for your API calls. The only reason our demos are using get. Send header data, query parameters, and or body data for your data call. Send header data, body parameters, or God, I can't. Send heading. Golly, Bill.